Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that the tariffs you hear about in the news could soon translate into a $2,000 check in your mailbox? And what if I told you that the true cost of that check might be far higher than the check itself? A significant and recurring theme has emerged in the current political landscape: the formal pledge by President Donald Trump to institute a tariff dividend, a direct payment to Americans funded by his administration's signature trade policy. This concept, which blurs the line between fiscal stimulus and trade policy, has become a cornerstone of his economic messaging. The specifics of this proposal, its justification, and its administrative backing merit close examination to understand its potential as a functioning government program. The core of the proposal was delivered on November 9th via a post on the Truth Social platform. In this announcement, President Trump unequivocally committed to a dividend payment of at least $2,000 per person. This was not framed as a hypothetical idea or a negotiation tactic. The language used was one of firm commitment. This specific sum, $2,000, appears to be a baseline, with the president's own words suggesting the final amount could be higher. Crucially, the proposal delineates a specific target audience. The payments are intended for low and middle income American citizens, with an explicit carve out for high income earners who would be excluded from the program. This positions the dividend as a form of targeted economic relief, aiming to bolster the financial standing of the majority of American households rather than acting as a universal flat payment to all citizens. The funding mechanism is the proposal's most defining and controversial feature. The $2,000 payments are slated to be funded entirely by revenue generated from massive tariffs imposed on foreign nations. This linkage is central to the policy's identity. It is presented not as new government spending financed by debt, but as a redistribution of monies collected from other countries at the border. This narrative suggests a self funding closed loop system where trade enforcement actions directly finance household support. Furthermore, the proposal includes a secondary and equally ambitious fiscal goal. President Trump has stated that all leftover tariff revenue, that which remains after the dividend payments are disbursed, will be used to substantially pay down the $37 trillion national debt. This dual promise aims to address two distinct political concerns simultaneously, providing direct relief to citizens while also making a tangible move toward fiscal responsibility. This is not a solitary musing. The administration has reinforced this message through key officials. National Economic Advisor Kevin Hassett, along with Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, has confirmed that the administration is actively studying the matter and in the process of working through details. This indicates that the proposal has moved beyond rhetorical flourish and into the realm of preliminary policy development within the White House. The rationale for the specific $2,000 amount has also been articulated. Kevin Hassett, in his economic analysis, has argued that the figure is not arbitrary, but rather a calculated corrective measure. According to Hassett, under the previous administration, American workers saw their real purchasing power drop by approximately $3,400 due to inflation and other economic factors. In contrast, he argues that under the Trump administration, purchasing power has already risen by $1,200. The proposed $2,000 check is therefore intended to bridge that gap, effectively making households whole for the net purchasing power they lost. It is framed as a targeted re-equalization of economic standing, directly funded by the proceeds of an assertive trade policy. This narrative of a committed president, a defined plan, and a logical justification forms the complete picture of the tariff dividend proposal as presented to the public. But to really understand this proposal, we have to look past the political presentation and examine the economic reality of how tariffs actually work. While the political narrative of the tariff dividend is clear and compelling, its foundational premise that foreign nations will finance these $2,000 payments faces significant scrutiny when measured against the established mechanics of international trade and customs law. The discrepancy between the political rhetoric and the economic reality of who ultimately bears the cost of a tariff is the central challenge to the proposal's funding claims. The assertion that foreign countries directly pay tariffs to the United States government is a simplification that economists and customs experts dispute. The mechanism of collection is explicitly defined by United States law. According to Title 19, customs duties, the legal liability for the tariff fee rests with the importer of record. This entity is the American business, be it a massive retailer like Walmart, Target, or Amazon, or a smaller domestic manufacturer importing raw materials that brings the foreign goods into the United States. The payment is collected from this American entity by Customs and Border Protection at the port of entry. The foreign exporter does not write a check to the U.S. Treasury. Once this cost is incurred by the American importer, standard business logic dictates the subsequent chain of events. Publicly traded companies, such as the large retailers who are the nation's biggest importers, have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to protect profit margins. They cannot and will not simply absorb a multi-billion-dollar tax increase without a corresponding business adjustment. This adjustment inevitably comes in the form of cost passing. The tariff, which is essentially a tax on an imported good, is treated as an increased cost of goods sold. This additional cost is then passed down the supply chain, ultimately landing on the final consumer, the American household. Major retailers, including Nike, Home Depot, and AutoZone, have been transparent about this fact, confirming that they have raised prices on goods affected by tariffs to offset the new tax. Therefore, the cost of the tariff is not paid by the foreign nation, but rather by the American consumer in the form of higher prices for everyday goods. This economic reality is not a theoretical model. It is the observable outcome in the marketplace. The impact of this cost passing mechanism is a direct and measurable inflationary pressure, particularly on imported goods that are not easily substituted with domestic alternatives. While the official Consumer Price Index, CPI, might report a broad inflation rate of, for example, 3%, the specific impact on heavily imported product categories is often far more severe. We see this clearly in grocery aisles. The price of coffee, a product largely imported, has seen spikes as high as 40%. The price of bananas, another import staple, has risen by 8.6%. These are not abstract statistics. They are tangible increases in the cost of living for American families. The very tariffs intended to fund the $2,000 relief checks are, in practice, contributing to the erosion of purchasing power that the checks are meant to combat. This creates a contradictory cycle where the solution is functionally identical to the problem. The government is, in effect, collecting a distributed tax from consumers via higher prices, pooling that money, and then returning a portion of it in a lump sum payment. This contradictory cycle is the first major issue. But beyond that economic friction, the proposal faces an even more fundamental challenge, the fundamental arithmetic. Let's look at the math problem of revenue versus expenditures. Beyond the economic friction of the tariff's true cost, the tariff dividend proposal faces an even more fundamental and immediate challenge. The fundamental arithmetic, when the projected costs of the program are set against the actual revenues collected and then placed in the context of the nation's overall fiscal health, the numbers do not align. The plan, as stated, appears mathematically impossible without resorting to the very deficit spending it claims to avoid. First, let us examine the estimated costs of the program. The administration has specified that the payments will target low and middle income Americans based on the income thresholds used for the 2021 stimulus payments, which defined the cutoff at under $75,000 for individuals and under $150,000 for married couples. This program would reach a vast portion of the populace. This definition of low and middle income would make roughly 85% of American adults eligible, translating to approximately 220 million people. The total expense of this commitment is staggering. A single $2,000 payment distributed to 220 million individuals would cost the U.S. Treasury $440 billion. If the payment were to be higher, as the at least language suggests, or if dependents are included, this cost could easily approach or exceed $600 billion. This $600 billion figure represents the high-end liability of the promise. Next, we must analyze the revenue side of the equation. The tariffs, which are the sole designated funding source, are indeed generating significant revenue. However, that revenue stream is dwarfed by the program's cost. For the current calendar year, 2025, tariff collections are on track to bring in a total of roughly $300 billion. This is a substantial sum, but it is at best only half of what is needed to fund the $600 billion dividend program. This deficit is magnified exponentially when placed against the backdrop of the federal budget. The United States government is currently running a massive structural deficit. In a single recent month, the federal deficit, the gap between what the government spends and what it collects, was $345 billion. This means the government overspent by more in 1 month than the tariffs will bring in during the entire year. Herein lies the core mathematical fallacy of the proposal. The $300 billion in annual tariff revenue, which is already insufficient to cover the $600 billion dividend, only covers approximately 10% of the government's monthly overspending. The conclusion is stark and unavoidable. It is mathematically impossible to use $300 billion to simultaneously fund a $600 billion stimulus program and make any payment, substantial or otherwise, toward the $37 trillion national debt. The two core promises of the proposal are mutually exclusive. To fulfill the $2,000 dividend pledge, the administration would have to, by necessity, borrow at least $300 billion, thereby increasing the national debt, the very outcome the proposal claims to be solving. The math simply does not support the political narrative. So, if the math doesn't support the narrative, it raises an obvious question about the timing and the political strategy behind the announcement. Given the significant fiscal discrepancy between the program's costs and its funding, the proposal's timing and the legislative strategy behind it become critically important. The rollout of such a massive expenditure is not just an economic decision, but a deeply political one, with a timeline that appears explicitly designed to maximize electoral impact. The administration has provided indications of a potential timeline. In statements made from the Oval Office, the president has suggested that the distribution of these checks would likely occur in the middle of next year, with a more specific window pointed toward the late summer or early fall. This timing is not coincidental. This proposed distribution window aligns perfectly with the run up to the midterm elections. The arrival of a $2,000 check in the bank accounts of millions of voters just weeks or months before they head to the polls is a political strategy of immense power. It transforms the dividend from a simple economic support program into a potent tool for voter mobilization, creating a tangible sense of goodwill and financial benefit directly linked to the incumbent administration immediately before a critical election. However, executing this strategy is fraught with legislative and judicial hurdles. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has been clear on one critical point. This dividend cannot be created through a simple executive order. Unlike the tariffs themselves, which were implemented using executive authority, a massive fiscal appropriation and distribution of this nature requires new legislation to be lawfully passed by both houses of Congress. This moves the battle from the White House to Capitol Hill. This legislative requirement gives rise to what is being described as a trap strategy. The Republican led administration may intentionally introduce the dividend bill in Congress during the height of the election season. This move would be designed to force Democrats into an impossible political position. If Democratic lawmakers vote against the bill, citing the valid economic and fiscal concerns, such as its inflationary impact or its reliance on deficit spending, they will be on record as opposing a $2,000 payment for their constituents. This creates a powerful political attack ad in the making. The administration could then campaign by claiming that they tried to give Americans their money, but the opposition party blocked it. Fearing this exact scenario, many Democrats might feel politically blackmailed into voting yes, regardless of their economic objections. In this scenario, opposing free money for voters right before an election is widely seen as political suicide. This strategy aims to force bipartisan support and ensure the bill's passage not on its economic merits, in which it is weak, but on its political necessity, in which it is strong. Complicating this entire political calculus is a significant external threat, the judicial branch. The tariffs that form the entire funding basis for the proposal are currently being challenged in the Supreme Court. The legal arguments against them are substantial, and a ruling that strikes them down as an unconstitutional overreach of executive power is a distinct possibility. If the Supreme Court were to strike down the tariffs, the financial architecture of the dividend proposal would instantly collapse. Tariff revenue would plummet from the current $300 billion to less than $100 billion, the amount collected from older, undisputed tariffs. This would not only make the dividend impossible to fund, but would also obliterate the leftover money designated for debt reduction. The entire program, therefore, rests on a precarious legal foundation that could be removed at any moment by a court ruling, rendering the entire political and economic debate moot. Now, let's set aside those massive hurdles for a moment and assume the proposal actually moves forward. The focus would then shift to the enormous logistical operation of its distribution. That means we need to talk about eligibility and how they'd actually get the money to people. Assuming the tariff dividend proposal successfully navigates the complex legislative hurdles and survives its judicial challenges, the focus would then shift to the enormous logistical operation of its distribution. The core questions become practical. Who precisely qualifies for the $2,000 payment, and what mechanism will the government use to deliver that money? The who will be determined by income thresholds. The administration's low and middle income targeting strongly suggests a repeat of the eligibility rules from the 2021 stimulus. This would mean that individuals earning under $75,000 per year and married couples earning under $150,000 per year would receive the full $2,000 payment. It is also likely that the payment would phase out for those earning above these thresholds, declining to zero at a higher income cap. A critical point of clarification revolves around employment status. While the proposal is often discussed using the political shorthand of working families, the actual eligibility is based purely on adjusted gross income, not on whether an individual holds a job. This is a crucial distinction. It means that retirees, Social Security beneficiaries, and individuals receiving disability payments, SSDI, or supplemental security income, SSI, would be included provided their total income falls below the $75,000 or $150,000 cap. Veterans receiving VA benefits would similarly be eligible. The determining factor is income, not the source of that income. The how involves the specific financial mechanism used for distribution, which would almost certainly be an advance refundable tax credit. This technical sounding term is vital for ensuring the program's reach. Here is how it works. The government would pass a law creating a new $2,000 refundable tax credit for the upcoming tax year. A refundable credit is one that is paid out in full, even if the recipient has zero tax liability. For example, if a retiree has an income so low that they owe $0 in federal taxes, a non refundable credit would be worthless to them. A refundable credit, however, means the government will send them a check for the full $2,000. The advance part of the name simply means the government does not wait until citizens file their taxes next year to send the money. Instead, it sends the payment now as an advance on that future credit. This is the exact mechanism used for the 2020 and 2021 stimulus checks. It allows the Treasury to use recent tax filings or Social Security beneficiary data to quickly send payments via direct deposit or paper check, reaching tens of millions of people, including non filers and those with no tax burden, in a matter of weeks. This established logistical pathway is the only one capable of executing a program of this scale and speed. But the how and who of this program are only part of the story. We must also analyze the deeper structural damage this policy linkage creates well beyond the immediate inflation concerns. This proposal doesn't just invent a new stimulus, it fundamentally ties that stimulus to the administration's flagship industrial policy, the tariffs. And when we examine the performance of that underlying policy, the entire proposal becomes even more precarious. Let's remember, the tariffs were never initially sold as a revenue tool for stimulus checks. They were justified as a strategic weapon of industrial policy. The stated goal was to revive the American manufacturing sector by making foreign goods more expensive, thereby forcing companies to move production and jobs back to the United States. This was the core promise. However, the data on this primary objective is, at best, deeply underwhelming. Since the tariffs were broadly implemented, the manufacturing sector has not seen the promised renaissance. In fact, in some key periods, it has shed tens of thousands of jobs. This suggests the policy is failing at its original goal. The proposal to use its revenue for a dividend, therefore, looks less like a victory lap and more like a pivot, an attempt to find a new, more popular use for a policy that is not delivering on its core industrial policy promises. Furthermore, this analysis only looks at one side of the trade ledger. Tariffs are not implemented in a vacuum, they invite retaliation. This is the second order effect that is rarely mentioned in the political messaging. When the US imposes tariffs on foreign steel, China and the European Union do not simply pay the tax. They retaliate with their own tariffs, precision targeted at the most politically sensitive American exports. This is why American farmers, particularly soybean growers, have faced catastrophic market losses. It's why manufacturers like American motorcycle companies have been forced to move production overseas to avoid retaliatory tariffs in their key European markets. This creates another profound contradiction. The very low and middle income workers in the agricultural and manufacturing sectors who are meant to be the beneficiaries of the $2,000 check are the same people being directly harmed by the retaliatory actions that the tariff policy itself provokes. The dividend, in this light, looks less like a bonus and more like a small compensation payment for a trade war that is costing them their livelihoods. Finally, there is the long term corrosive effect on supply chain stability. Businesses, from small importers to multinational corporations, crave certainty. They must make investment decisions that span 5, 10, or 20 years. A trade policy built on sudden announcements, executive orders, and the constant looming threat of a Supreme Court reversal is the very definition of uncertainty. This volatility doesn't incentivize companies to build new factories in Ohio. It incentivizes them to build them in Mexico, Vietnam, or other countries. Not engaged in a chaotic trade dispute, it accelerates the very supply chain fragmentation the policy was meant to reverse. In this context, the proposal to siphon off the tariff revenue for a one-time check rather than using it for, say, massive infrastructure or R&D investment to actually support domestic industry is a tacit admission that the policy is about short-term political wins, not long-term industrial strategy. Finally, after covering the politics, the funding, and the logistics, it's imperative that we analyze the macroeconomic consequences. What would injecting a sum of this magnitude actually do to the economy, to inflation, and to the financial markets? Finally, it is imperative to analyze the macroeconomic consequences of injecting a sum of this magnitude into the economy. This punishes savers. Cash held in a savings account or under the mattress loses its purchasing power every day. The rational response, therefore, is to move currency into productive assets that can retain or grow their value. This includes stocks, real estate, and other commodities. The ultimate market implication of the tariff dividend is a reinforcement of the idea that in a modern, high deficit economy, holding cash is a losing proposition, and the ownership of assets is the primary vehicle for wealth preservation.